The Story of Sir Francis Drake by Alfred H. Miles. B.Y. John Campbell. Francis Drake is said to have been born at Crowndale, near Tavistock, about the year 1540. Both his birth and his parentage are involved in obscurity, but it is probable that he was born of good family in reduced circumstances, for he was declared by the King of Arms in 1551 to have the right, by just descent and progeniture of birth, to bear the arms of the Drakes of Ash, while it is clear that he began life in a humble capacity. According to Camden, he was apprenticed at an early age to the master of a small coasting vessel, who, dying without issue, left the bark to him. We find also that at the age of 18, he was purser on board a ship trading to Biscay, and at 20, he made a voyage to Guinea. At 22, he had the honor to be appointed captain of the Judith in the harbor of St. John de Ulua in the Gulf of Mexico, where he behaved most gallantly in the glorious action fought there under his kinsman, Sir John Hawkins, described in the story of Sir John Hawkins, and afterwards returned with him into England with a great reputation, but not worth a single groat. Upon this he conceived a design of making reprisals on the King of Spain, which some say was put into his head by the minister of his ship. And to be sure, in see divinity, the case was clear. The King of Spain's subjects had undone Mr. Drake, and therefore Mr. Drake was at liberty to take the best satisfaction he could on the subjects of the King of Spain. This doctrine, how rudely soever preached, was very taking in England, and therefore he no sooner published his design than he had numbers of volunteers ready to accompany him, though they had no such pretence even as he had to color their proceedings. In 1570, he made his first expedition with 2 ships, the Dragon and the Swan, and the next year in the Swan alone, wherein he returned safe, with competent advantages, if not rich, and having now means sufficient to perform greater matters, as well as skill to conduct them, he laid the plan of a more important design with respect to himself and to his enemies. This he put in execution on May 24th, 1572, on which day he sailed from Plymouth, himself in a ship called the Pasha, of the burden of 70 tons, and his brother, John Drake, in the Swan, of 25 tons burden, their whole strength consisting of no more than 23 men and boys. And with this inconsiderable force, on July 22nd, he attacked the town of Nombre de Dios, which he took in a few hours by storm, notwithstanding a dangerous wound he received early in the action. Yet upon the whole he was no great gainer, for after a very brisk action he was obliged to betake himself to his ships with very little booty. His next attempt was to plunder the mules laden with silver, which passed from Vera Cruz to Nombre de Dios, but in this scheme too he was disappointed. However, he attacked the town of Vera Cruz, carried it, and got some little booty. In returning, he met unexpectedly with a string of 50 mules laden with plate, of which he carried off as much as he could, and buried the rest. In these expeditions he was greatly assisted by the Cymrons, a nation of Indians who were engaged in a perpetual war with the Spaniards. The prince or captain of these people, whose name was Pedro, was presented by Captain Drake with a fine cutlass, which he at that time wore, and to which he saw the Indian had a mind. Pedro, in return, gave him 4 large wedges of gold, which Drake threw into the common stock, saying that he thought it, but just that such as bore the charge of so uncertain a voyage on his credit should share the utmost advantages that voyage produced. Then embarking his men with all the wealth he had obtained, which was very considerable, he bore away for England, and was so fortunate as to sail in 23 days from Cape Florida to the Isles of Scilly, and thence, without any accident, to Plymouth, where he arrived August 9th, 1573. His success in this expedition, joined to his honorable behavior towards his owners, gained him a high reputation, and the use he made of his riches still a greater. For fitting out 3 stout frigates at his own expense, he sailed with them to Ireland, where, under Walter, Earl of Essex, the father of the unfortunate Earl, who was beheaded, he served as a volunteer and did many glorious actions. After the death of his noble patron, he returned to England, where Sir Christopher Hatton, who was then Vice-Chamberlain to Queen Elizabeth and a great favorite, took him under his protection, introduced him to Her Majesty, and procured him her countenance. By this means, he acquired facilities for undertaking that glorious expedition which will render his name immortal. His first proposal was to voyage into the South Seas through the Straits of Magellan, an enterprise which hitherto no Englishman had ever attempted. This project was well received at court, and in a short time Captain Drake saw himself at the height of his wishes, for in his former voyage, having had a distant prospect of the South Seas from the top of a tree which he ascended for the purpose, he framed an ardent prayer to God that he might sail an English ship in them, which he found now an opportunity of attempting, the Queen's permission furnishing him with the means, and his own fame quickly drawing to him a force sufficient. The squadron with which he sailed on this extraordinary undertaking consisted of the following ships: the Pelican, commanded by himself, of the burden of 100 tons, the Elizabeth, vice-admiral, 80 tons, under Captain John Winter, the Marigold, a bark of 30 tons, commanded by Captain John Thomas, the Swan, flyboat of 50 tons, under Captain John Chester, and the Christopher, a pinnace of 15 tons, under Captain Thomas Moon. In this fleet were embarked no more than 164 able men, and all the necessary provisions for so long and dangerous a voyage, the intent of which, however, was not openly declared. Thus equipped, on November 15, 1577, about 3 in the afternoon, he sailed from Plymouth, but a heavy storm taking him as soon as he was out of port, forced him, in a very bad condition, into Falmouth to refit, which, being expeditiously performed, he again put to sea on the 13th of December following. On the 25th of the same month, he fell in with the coast of Barbary, and on the 29th with Cape Verde. The 13th of March he passed the equinoctial. The 5th of April he made the coast of Brazil in 30 degrees N lat, and entered the River de la Plata, where he lost the company of 2 of his ships, but meeting them again, and having taken out of them all the provisions they had on board, he turned them adrift. On August 20th, with his squadron reduced to 3 ships, he entered the Straits of Magellan. On September 25th he passed them, having then only his own ship, which, in the South Seas, he renamed the Golden Hind. It may not be amiss to take notice here of a fact very little known, as appearing in no relation of this famous voyage. Sir Francis Drake himself reported to Sir Richard, son to Sir John Hawkins, that meeting with a violent tempest, in which his ship could bear no sail, he found, when the storm sank, he was driven through or round the straits into the latitude of 50 degrees. Here, lying close under an island, he went on shore, and leaning his body over a promontory as far as he could safely, told his people, when he came on board, he had been farther south than any man living. This we find confirmed by one of our old chronicle writers, who farther informs us that he bestowed on this island the name of Elizabetha in honor of his royal mistress. On November 25th, he came to Macho in the latitude of 30 degrees, where he had appointed a rendezvous in case his ships separated, but the Marigold had gone down with all hands, and Captain Winter, having repassed the straits, had returned to England. Thence he continued his voyage along the coasts of Chile and Peru, taking all opportunities of seizing Spanish ships, or of landing and attacking them on shore, till his crew was sated with plunder. While off the island of Mocha, Drake landed with some of his men to seek water, but the inhabitants, mistaking them for Spaniards, attacked them, killed 2 of their number, and wounded several others, including Drake himself, who was shot in the face with an arrow. As the surgeon of the Golden Hind was dead, Drake had to be his own doctor as well as surgeon to his crew. Realizing that the attack had been made in mistake, and not wishing to risk more casualties, Drake did not attempt to punish the natives, but put to sea and made his way to Valparaiso, where he made free with the stores and valuables he found, and then proceeded further in search of his missing vessels, and finding others which added to his booty, from one of which he took a number of charts of seas then utterly unknown to the English mariners. While pursuing this course, he gained intelligence of a rich ship laden with gold and silver for Panama, which he fell in with off Cape Francisco on March 1, 1579, and captured. The booty in this case amounted to 26 tons of silver, 80 pounds of gold, 13 chests of money, and a quantity of jewels and precious stones, valued in all at nearly 200,000 pounds. Coasting North America to the height of 48 degrees, he endeavored to find a passage back into our seas on that side, but being disappointed of what he sought, he landed and called the country New Albion, taking possession of it in the name and for the use of Queen Elizabeth, and having trimmed his ship set sail thence, on September 29, 1579, for the Moluccas, choosing this passage round rather than returning by the Straits of Magellan, owing to the danger of being attacked at a great disadvantage by the Spaniards, and the lateness of the season, whence dangerous storms and hurricanes were to be apprehended. On November 4th he sighted the Moluccas, and on December 10th made Celebes, where his ship unfortunately ran on a rock on the 9th of January, whence, beyond all expectation, and in a manner miraculously, they got off and continued their course. On March 16th he arrived at Java, where he determined on returning directly home. On March 25th, 1580, he put this design in execution, and on June 15th doubled the Cape of Good Hope, having then on board his ship 57 men and but 3 casks of water. On July 12th he passed the line, reached the coast of Guinea on the 16th, and there watered. On September 11th he made the island of Terceira, and on the 26th of the same month entered the harbor of Plymouth. In this voyage he completely circumnavigated the globe, which no commander-in-chief had ever done before. His success in this enterprise, and the immense mass of wealth he brought home, naturally raised much comment throughout the kingdom, some highly commending and some as loudly decrying him. The former alleged that his exploit was not only honorable to himself, but to his country, that it would establish our reputation for maritime skill amongst foreign nations, and raise a useful spirit of emulation at home, and that as to the money, our merchants having suffered deeply from the faithless practices of the Spaniards, there was nothing more just than that the nation should receive the benefit of Drake's reprisals. The other party alleged that, in fact, he was no better than a pirate, that, of all others, it least became a trading nation to encourage such practices, that it was not only a direct breach of all our late treaties with Spain, but likewise of our old leagues with the House of Burgundy, and that the consequences of owning his proceeding would be much more fatal than the benefits reaped from it could be advantageous. Things continued in this uncertainty during the remainder of that and the spring of the succeeding year. At length they took a better turn, for on Apeth, 1581, Her Majesty, dining at Diptford in Kent, went on board Captain Drake's ship, where she conferred on him the honor of knighthood, and declared her absolute approbation of all that he had done, to the confusion of his enemies and to the great joy of his friends. She likewise gave directions for the preservation of his ship, that it might remain a monument of his own and his country's glory. In process of time, the vessel decaying, it was broken up, but a chair made of the planks was presented to the University of Oxford and is still preserved. In the year 1582, he was mayor of Plymouth, and in 1580, a member of the House of Commons. In 1585, he concerted a scheme of a West Indian expedition with the celebrated Sir Philip Sidney. It was to be partly maritime and partly an invasion. The sea force was to be commanded absolutely by Sir Francis, the land troops by Sir Philip Sidney. The Queen having required Sir Philip to desist from his scheme, Drake sailed, notwithstanding, to the West Indies, having under his command Captain Christopher Carlisle, Captain Martin Frobisher, Captain Francis Knollys, and many other officers of great reputation. In this expedition he took the cities of St. Diego, St. Domingo, Cartagena, and St. Augustine, exceeding even the expectation of his friends and the hopes of the common people, though both were sanguine to the last degree. Yet the profits of this expedition were but moderate, the design of Sir Francis being rather to weaken the enemy than to enrich himself. It was, to do him justice, a maxim from which he never varied, to regard the service of his country first, next the profit of his proprietors, and last, his own interest. Hence, though rich in wealth, he was richer still in reputation. In 1587, he proceeded to Lisbon with a fleet of 30 sail, and having intelligence of a numerous fleet assembled in the Bay of Cadiz, which was to have made part of the Armada, he with great courage entered the port and burnt upwards of 10,000 tons of shipping. Drake's policy was to attack the enemy in his own harbors and so prevent the possibility of his invading our coasts, and this policy he was continually pressing upon the home government, but without success. There can be little doubt that if he had been allowed to follow up his success in the Bay of Cadiz, by carrying out this policy, the Spanish Armada might have never set sail. Not obtaining the support and authority he wanted, he now resolved to do his utmost to content the merchants of London, who had contributed, by a voluntary subscription, to the fitting out of his fleet. With this view, having intelligence of a large carrack expected at Terceira from the East Indies, thither he sailed, and though his men were severely pinched through want of victuals, yet by fair words and large promises he prevailed upon them to endure these hardships for a few days. Within this time, the East India ship arrived, and was found to contain wealth to the value of £100,000, which he took and carried home in triumph. It was in consequence of the journals, charts, and papers taken on board his East India prize that it was judged practicable for us to enter into the Indian trade, for promoting which the Queen, by letters patent, in the 43rd year of her reign, founded our first India Company. To this, we may also add that it was Drake who first brought in tobacco, the use of which was much promoted by the practice of Sir Walter Raleigh. How much this nation has gained by these branches of commerce, of which he was properly the author, I leave to the intelligent reader's consideration. In 1588, Sir Francis Drake was appointed Vice-Admiral, under Charles Lord Howard of Effingham, High Admiral of England. Here his fortune favoured him as remarkably as ever, for he made prize of a large galleon, commanded by Don Pedro de Valdez, who yielded on the bare mention of his name. In this vessel 50,000 ducats were distributed among the seamen and soldiers. It must not, however, be dissembled that, through an oversight of his, the admiral ran the utmost hazard of being taken by the enemy, for Drake being appointed, the first night of the engagement, to carry lights for the direction of the English fleet, he being in full pursuit of some hulks belonging to the Hanse towns, neglected it, which occasioned the admirals following the Spanish lights, and remaining almost in the center of their fleet till morning. However, his succeeding services sufficiently effaced the memory of this mistake, the greatest execution done on the flying Spaniards being performed by the squadron under his command. The next year he was employed as admiral at sea over the fleet sent to restore Don Antonio, King of Portugal, the command of the land forces being given to Sir John Norris. They were hardly at sea, however, before these commanders differed, though it is on all hands agreed that there never was an admiral better disposed, with respect to soldiers, than Sir Francis Drake. The ground of their difference was this: the general was bent on landing at the Groyne, whereas Sir Francis and the sea officers were for sailing to Lisbon directly, in which, if their advice had been taken, without question their enterprise would have succeeded, and Don Antonio would have been restored. For it appeared, on their invading Portugal, that the enemy had made use of the time they gave them to such good purpose that it was not possible to make any impression. Sir John Norris, indeed, marched by land to Lisbon, and Sir Francis Drake, very imprudently, promised to sail up the river with his whole fleet. But when he saw the consequences which would have attended the keeping of his word, he chose rather to break his promise than to hazard the Queen's navy, for which he was grievously reproached by Norris, and the miscarriage of the whole affair was imputed to his failure in performing what he had undertaken. Yet Sir Francis fully justified himself on his return, for he made it manifest to the Queen and Council that all the service that was done was performed by him, and that his sailing up the river of Lisbon would have signified nothing to the taking the castle, which was 2 miles off, and without reducing that there was no taking the town. In 1590, he seems to have devoted himself to civil engineering, for we find him contracting with the town of Plymouth to effect a water supply from the river Meavy, which he did by conducting a stream a distance of nearly 25 miles, after which he erected 6 mills for grinding corn in 1591. In 1593, he represented Plymouth in Parliament. His next service was the fatal undertaking, in conjunction with Sir John Hawkins, in 1594, for the destroying of Nombre de Dios, referred to in the story of Sir John Hawkins, who died the day before Sir Francis made his desperate attack on the shipping in the harbor of Puerto Rico. This was performed, with all the courage imaginable, on November 13, 1595, and attended with great loss to the Spaniards, yet with very little advantage to the English, who, meeting with a more resolute resistance and much better fortifications than they expected, were obliged to sheer off. The admiral then steered for the Main, where he took the town of Rio de la Hacha, which he burnt to the ground, a church and a single house belonging to a lady only excepted. After this, he destroyed some other villages, and then proceeded to Santa Marta, which he likewise burnt. The like fate had the famous town of Nombre de Dios, the Spaniards refusing to ransom any of these places, and the booty taken in them being very inconsiderable. On December 29th, Sir Thomas Baskerville marched with 750 men towards Panama, but returned on January 2nd, finding the design of reducing that place to be wholly impracticable. This disappointment made such an impression on the admiral's mind that it threw him into a lingering fever, of which he died on the 28th of January, 1596, just 2 months after his distinguished kinsman, Sir John Hawkins, with whom he had been so often associated and with so much glory.